Fatah Arafat going to UN, speaking about when he gave his famous speech there. This olive branch, for example, it became a rhetoric design in all of the Palestinian factions after 74. So that is like for me, looking at image and image development, this is a point in the history, and I'm looking at it from that perspective. Yeah.
I was curious in response to a few things that you've said about where the film is showing in terms of throughout Palestine and the Arab world particularly, and even within Israel, and how, like, you know, if it's kind of an emotive or even motivational film, kind of, is there still the spaces, like, for instance, you said these films were shown in refugee camps initially, and etc.
No, definitely doesn't have the same mobilizing power or motives as it used to. But it's very interesting to see the amount of discussions that comes after showing this film. Whether it shows in several times in Palestine, in Ramallah, in West Bank, had a 1 week release in cinema. Many people came and saw it, and it's very interesting to see the difference between the older generation and the younger generation. Especially, I'm talking about Palestinian audience, because this is my main audience. I wanted to make a dialogue with them, and somehow the older generation, for them, it's like, this is not useful. We have to forget about that. The younger generation is like, how don't we know that? And blaming their elder parents about, like, why didn't you transfer this? So it's a sign of defeat for the older. It's a sign of a hope for younger. And I think that is the discourse that we needed to bring out. And the Arabs, I don't know, like, we only screened it in Dubai and in Cairo. It was fairly nicely received, but it's also out of context. It's very interesting to see how is that playing with people who produce images today, and within, like, the Syrian revolution or the Egyptian revolution. I call them revolutions. I mean, other people don't. And see that, like, how image and representation is very big part of a struggle itself, and that we need to be thinking about it. I mean, working on that period while the Syrian and Egyptian thing was happening, it gave me kind of, especially seeing the failures that happened after that, gave me part of, like, yeah, it's okay. People will learn more, and they will get to understand their tools, and they will come back and they will make films, and to know that history is not a moment, and struggle is not just one thing. It happens, you win or lose. No, it's a very long, elastic process.
Is there any opportunity to show it in Gaza?
It showed in Gaza. It also showed in Gaza.
Hi, just to say, I mean, the point you made is that you weren't going to talk about the narrative, the sequence of Palestinian history. You were leaving people to make up their own minds. So, is anybody here who's interested in knowing about the narrative? Palestine Solidarity Campaign, I've got a meeting a week tomorrow, which will be looking at the history of the national movement. So if anybody wants that, do come along. It's at the Friends Meeting House.
Yes.
But I've got a film question. You mentioned you gathered an archive of data, archive of film. Sorry, I slipped in my own discipline by accident there. What I was wondering is, how did you move from having gathered all this material to forming a film and deciding what was the issue you're going to project, or did you set out with a particular objective to put over a particular idea, a representation of the Palestinian people? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, how much of the film you gathered ended up on the cutting floor? Is there a lot of other material there that you could look at, or that others could look at?
Of course. I mean, it's very, I mean, I was learning, because while the process was going on, like finding a film and then seeing a certain narrative through Fatah, for example, and then finding another film that is a PFLP that is telling something else. So, and I still was finding films while I was in the editing. So, and somehow I was like, I don't know what I'm going to say. because the question, the problem of these films, these material, that they are about representation, and I didn't want to be representative. I wanted to take out the political narrative elements from these material and try to make it speak to itself. So I feel I'm just the agent that try to put the things together and to try to be as much honest, not to the narratives, as much as to the images itself. So I think that's the thing. It was more of experimentation on the timetable, and then at the end of the day, I choose what I liked. I gave the liberty to myself to just like, okay, I love these families sitting all with guns, with the sound and everything. I will keep them. Whatever the story is, I'm gonna keep them. And there are like 6 sequences that survive through the editing that I don't know why they are there, except because I like them, as the mise-en-scène and the movement inside the color, the sharpness, the contrast. It's like, it's my aesthetics in somehow. So I kept them because of that.
There's one thing that we don't get a sense of, and that's because you're not giving a narrative on top.
Yeah.
And that is that some of the footage is pure documentary, and it's documentary in its purest form. And some of the footage, in a sense, was a kind of documentary sort of evidence, if you like, that was staged. By the PLO and by and we don't know which bits are which in the film. And was that intentional? Did you just not want? Did you?
No, but that's. I mean, I was following there. It's like that's. Okay, the beginning of the beginning of the revolution between 68 and 72, it was building the image. So there was a need to create the scenes, in somehow, because they didn't want to show refugees. It wasn't about the reality, and that's what Arafat says. We managed to create an image or a people that we changed the people from being refugees to being freedom fighters. So they wouldn't go to film the refugees. It was even because they were ashamed of being refugees. Mm-hmm. This is the whole thing about making a revolution, is to return the dignity and come back to hold the arms and to go back. They wouldn't really interested about documenting or giving the image of the honor war, let's say, and they were actually fighting that kind of image. Mm-hmm. So which means that they needed to recreate a lot of scenes, which is the fighters are working on the land, or women working on the in factories, or people are training. These were happening, but also they were examples, took as examples, and they were, of course, there is kind of like, you do it like that, you do it like this, and you film it. Now, once the revolution became institutionalized, like after 74, and there was like a whole need to represent a different model, I think that's when we started to show that and that's where the West as well felt, the Palestinian felt that the image of the victim is more effective than the image of especially after Black September and all of the flips in the struggle itself. So they went back to do the revolution, the victim image again, and especially by the end, like we see a lot of, but that comes more from international filmmakers, that they come and film the dead bodies and the destruction of the houses and the people who are suffering, more than showing, because we can't be the hero all the time. I think that cracked in the process, and this is the most important part for me. It's the first part. It's like when we created the image of the Fidai, but we see it dismantling itself. Just one thing to answer, it's like I collected around 35 films. I mean, I used the funding to make this film to scan and to restore these negatives. I did 35. I know that there is around 70. I know where they are, but I think in total there's around 300 films from that period, that many of them I don't know where are they. And in terms of archive that I had, it's around 45 hours that we only used 1 hour.
Yeah, you said you were you let the image speak for itself and
Or tried.
But I mean, that seems to me a very naive position to take, from a filmmaker's point of view, that an image doesn't speak for itself, it speaks for the filmmaker. So in that sense,